myself again. But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you.
Good afternoon and welcome to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith, and I'm delighted to welcome Mick Lowes back to the show. How are you, Mick?
I'm very good, Steve. You?
Yeah, good to see you, mate. And as always, only the football spoils my weekend. So we're back on again to discuss Newcastle United. We'll take the questions of the fans who are tuning in. And just want to thank everybody for subscribing to the channel this week. Over 1,000 new subscribers this week, which is quite phenomenal. And just shows that people are enjoying the content. So thanks very much for doing that. Mick, yesterday, was it a point earned or 2 points dropped?
I think probably in the scheme of things, Steve, believe it or not, I'll probably say a point gained. I know they had chances. I know Wolverhampton Wanderers had chances. But at the end of the day, they were under siege at the end. They were hanging on to a 1-0 lead initially, then a 1-all. So I think probably in the scheme of things, when these things pan out over a season and you look back at results over the final 15, 16 games, as much as you'd love your team to win 4 or 5, actually, it's about not losing. It's about not shipping goals. So in the scheme of things, it's at home to Wolves. But off the back of their recent form, I think it's probably a point gained.
Okay, there's, from our perspective, it's been a bad, day at the shop for injuries. Almiron, nothing confirmed yet, but he's going for a scan. And obviously ASM limping off again. And with Wilson already in the treatment room and not coming back anytime soon, it was a bad day for injuries.
Yeah, and obviously, the two players who invariably take the eye, Almiron and St. Maxim, are the two that you really worry about. I mean, I'm not sure what the extent of the injury is. Almiron I would probably worry about more than St. Maxim, believe it or not. But the key injury is Callum Wilson, because at this minute in time, you look at the 3 teams at the bottom, or, I know you can stretch it. I know you can say Burnley and Brighton are involved, and they probably are involved. But essentially, what you're worrying about most of all at the moment are Fulham. Fulham don't score goals. Brighton don't score goals. What was the stat flying around yesterday? 66 shots on target. 66 shots on goal, 20 on target, 1 goal for Brighton in the last 3 games. Now, we're not great, but Callum Wilson is in the top 10 Premier League scorers. He's sitting on the sidelines. We've got nobody else. I don't want to, and I came on today because 7 games ago, a month ago, whatever it was, I sort of laid into Joe Linton. And at the end of the day, I've said what I've said, and it's not constructive to keep going on about it. But if you look at the way they played yesterday, Newcastle, their approach play was good. All right, Wolves never really lifted a finger in the opening half hour, but Newcastle were decent. Almiron was a danger. St. Maxim in his own way was okay. Hayden and the likes were driving them on. They were okay. It was just until it got to the final third, the part of the park where you want, I know we're dreaming now, but you want a Shearer, or you just want a proven goal scorer to finish off the hard work that's been done by the rest of the side. What do we have? Absolutely nothing. We have a £40 million bloke who is an absolute waste of time. So I felt so sorry for the rest of the side, because they're slinging in crosses. They're trying to work openings. Almiron's hit a post, but I'm not too sure he might not have been offside. Anyway, but either way, these players are working and working and working, and there's no end product. So, to go back to my original point, there's no goals in there. We need goals from somewhere. But so too to Brighton, and so too to Fulham. Fulham are just as bad, if not worse, particularly at home, than Newcastle. So, it's all going to come out in the wash. And it really, after yesterday, when I came on a month ago, it was doom and gloom. I mean, it was proper doom and gloom. I'm not sure it's any better now, because Fulham are closer to us. But at the same time, we are then in turn closer to Burnley and to Brighton. And in the 7 games since I've come on, we've won twice. So it's very difficult to argue, is the situation worse than a month ago or better?
Yeah, it is certainly that. I've just picked up a few quotes from Steve Bruce's press conference after the game.
Yeah.
You know, he picked players out, which sometimes managers don't do, but he said Lewis should have stopped the cross, obviously with that goal. Dubravka, of course, making his return in between the sticks. He said he should have done better. The most controversial one for me was Richie didn't pass instructions on when he went onto the pitch. Obviously, that tactical change. And Joe Linton should have scored. I don't think anybody will disagree with that. But what was your take on his press conference after the match?
I think the last time I was on, I talked about how harrowing and how subdued and how almost ill he looked after the Villa game. And I'm not saying he looked any better, but I think he had more to talk about last night than he did then. In terms of, I agree. I know they've picked up on the substitution, and I know they've picked up on the lack of communication, and I'll come back to that in a second. But the bottom line is, and I don't think any Newcastle fan listening to this or watching this will disagree with this, Jamal Lewis can't defend. Jamal Lewis, who was allegedly wanted by Liverpool. I mean, Liverpool love fullbacks who can get forward. I mean, they've got two of the best in the business. And presumably they wanted Jamal Lewis for that same reason. Newcastle need Jamal Lewis to be a defender first and foremost, not an attacking fullback as Liverpool would have used him. As a defender, he's not good. He's not good. I watched it time and time again. He was, the winger wasn't even beating him for pay. The winger was just moving it and whipping it in. And it had happened before the goal. And sure enough, when he got it for the goal, I said, stop the cross. Not only does he not stop the cross, but the header, I mean, it's a brilliant header. It's a brilliant header. It's behind him and he's put it in the bottom corner. But again, the keeper's got a hand to it. And if a keeper in the Premier League gets a hand to that hand has to be strong enough to keep it out. So all these conspiracy theories about Richie didn't do this, Richie didn't do that, blah-de-blah-de-blah, nonsense. At the end of the day, a fullback didn't do his job and a goalkeeper didn't do his job. It was nothing to do with communication. And on the subject of communication, I don't know if anybody was watching the rugby in the afternoon, but the England-Wales game, there was an interesting interview afterwards by the BBC with Owen Farrell. And the question was asked of Owen Farrell, we heard you moaning at the referee about this, that and the other. We heard you moaning to your players. Were you unhappy with your players? Now, if there's 80,000 in the Principality Stadium in Wales, you don't hear that. But journalists are now being given the opportunity to hear what goes on the pitch. Owen Farrell completely blanked the question, quite rightly, because he's thinking, what on earth's going on? People are hearing what we're saying on the pitch. Exactly the same yesterday. Lascelles was asked the question afterwards. We understand. We heard you say. Likewise with the Richie, we heard the bench shouting, do this, do that. Now, is this right? Is this wrong? But it's a product of empty stadiums where everybody hears and sees. But not everybody, not fans, journalists and, others in the stand. So, they've picked up on that and I hate to say it because I've not come on here again to defend him. They've used it as a stick to beat Steve Bruce, who is allegedly unable to get his players to communicate. Take responsibility, players. When you play the game of football, you don't need to be told, oh, go out there and do your job. Just go out there and do your job. Yes, it was interesting in that instance that Kraft as a right fullback was being taken off and Richie as an essentially left-sided player was going on. And I did wonder when I was watching the substitution, how does this work? But it had nothing to do with the goal. The goal was down to Jamal Lewis unable to stop a cross and Martin Dubravka unable to stop what was a good header, but was definitely a savable header.
Yeah, I would agree. Let's start taking a couple of questions, Mick. Lee Taylor's wanting to know, should we be concerned about Steve Bruce not being able to get a message across to players? I mean, obviously it was mentioned yesterday he felt Richie didn't pass the message on, but we did have that, glorious moment against Arsenal when Willems came on and we conceded, straight away after lack of information getting on. Is it a concern, that?
Well, I have to say, you're right. And if it happens once, it's unfortunate. If it starts happening regularly, I mean, as I said there, I don't believe that that was the risk. That was the reason that they conceded the goal. That the communication was poor. I think that was just down to the fact that players didn't do their jobs, and it had nothing to do with the substitution of Richie. But a couple of things I did notice last night. One was the body language between Graham Jones and Steve Bruce. It was appalling. I mean, I only saw it a couple of times, but there was one conversation in particular where the camera must have gone on them for 20 seconds. And as Graham Jones was talking and presumably trying to put a point across, Steve Bruce looked like he would rather be anywhere in the world than listening to this fella. His eyes were going here and there. He was clearly not listening. I've heard other stuff today on the internet, which again is probably debatable at best, that there were more heated discussions between the pair of them. On the plus side, what I would say is, and I have no idea whether this is down to Graham Jones, and I have no idea where it's come from. So I'm not saying that this is something that Graham Jones has instigated since arriving. But the one thing that was noticeable to me watching that game yesterday that I've not seen in anything either this season or in the recent past was their invention on corners and free kicks. Things going short, corners going short, free kicks going short, little bits of invention, little bits of stuff that they've clearly worked on the training pitch. And actually, on 2 or 3 occasions, very nearly came off. I saw things last night that I hadn't seen in games going back recently. Now, if that's down to Jones as a coach or if that's down to the whole lot of them, I don't know. But that is a noticeable change. But, whether Steve Bruce can communicate with his players or not, I don't know. There was another conversation on the touchline between Steve Bruce, St. Maxim, and I think it was Jamal Lewis during a stoppage in play. And again, I wasn't convinced that the players were listening to what Steve Bruce was saying. But I'll tell you what, in the current climate, Steve, I would not be a manager for all the money and all the tea in China. It's these players, as I say, need to take responsibility. There's only so much a coach, there's only so much a manager can do. They weren't bad yesterday, but the three most attacking, the three most potent, the three most eye-catching players on the pitch, certainly for the first hour last night, were St. Maxim, Almiron and Traore for Wolves. Not one of them has an end product. They would drive managers, they drive fellow teammates crazy because they run down blind alleys. They do this, they do that. Managers must despair at these players because at the end of the day, they're not the brightest in the world. It's my favourite saying of all time in modern day football is that once upon a time, we created footballers who we wanted to be athletes. Now we have athletes who are dying to be footballers. They're not.
Great way of putting it, Mick. Great way of putting it. As always, we'll get questions which test your memory. This one's a good one. Darren says, Mick, if you could go back in time, which game would you want to do commentary on again?
I'd want to do commentary on Liverpool, Newcastle at Anfield, and I'd want Stan Collymore to be substituted after an hour, and I'd want Newcastle to win 3-2.
I love it. That was the game where I was sitting in the centenary stand and had to hot-footed across the park back to the bus because I was sitting amongst the home supporters who were wanting to cut me throat. So yeah, that was a happy memory, but for all the wrong reasons. John Richard says, do you think Steve Bruce is capable of keeping our club in the Premier League? Because at the moment, John believes that he's lost the plot.
It's debatable. It is highly, highly debatable. I came on here a month ago, Stephen said that I'd already nailed my colours to the mast and said that having lost at Villa the previous day, if they lost at Leeds, he probably should go. And I think I said that day, for the good of the club and for the good of Newcastle United, give somebody who's coming in enough time that he should go. We're 7 games down the line from that particular Sunday afternoon. And as I said, it's sod's law, but he's won 2 out of 7 and he got a draw last night. So we've gone from a situation where he had no win in 10 last time I was on, and they were literally treading water. And as I said at the top of the show, even though Fulham are closer to us, we in turn are closer to Brighton and Burnley. We are the centre of attention every year. We're in relegation trouble from the media. I mean, the lad who did the commentary last night is a good friend of mine, but he's playing to the crowd in the final 10 minutes when Wolves have got corner after corner, and he's giving it. God, this is amazing. Newcastle, they're in peril. Blah, blah. That wouldn't be the same if it was Brighton or Burnley in danger of going from 1-0 down, 1-0 up to 2-1 down. Newcastle are the bigger story. There will always be the bigger story. So, having picked up, 7 points from the last 18 doesn't read quite as well as having picked up 9 points from the last 45. And you go back through the stats and you can crunch all the numbers, Steve. Nobody, in terms of, let's go back to the most pertinent scenarios. When Steve McLaren was replaced by Benitez, and Alan Shearer came in for Joe Kinnear around about this sort of time, the incumbent managers hadn't won 2 of their previous 7, hadn't picked up 7 points from their previous 18. They were nowhere near it. We were in complete freefall. Now, we were in complete freefall a month ago. You could argue we're still pretty much in freefall, but it has tightened up a little bit. All I would say is I'm a little bit more confident that we might survive than I was a month ago. But at the same time, as you mentioned earlier, injuries could kill us. And Wilson's obviously the big one, but Almiron, St. Maxim, yeah, but Almiron I like Almiron's attitude. A lot of what he does is frustrating, but I like the fact that he works hard. I like the fact that he creates things, and he will be, if he's out for a considerable period of time, that's a huge miss.
Yeah, it is. It is a big miss. It's not the Rafa Benitez, but someone under that pseudonym today says, afternoon all, I think Joe Linton wasted his chances last night. Had Wilson had those chances, I dare say that he would have scored. I mean, Bruce did comment on Joe Linton at the end of the game, and, he looked, frustrated, as we all were. But we've discussed this before, and I don't want to get back into hammering the guy. It does no good. He's just, unfortunately, it's a position we're finding ourselves in with a £40 million player that can't do the business.
He'll be driving him mad, Steve. I mean, I said it plenty of times last time I was on, and he did allude to it. And obviously he's got to be quite careful what he says, Steve Bruce. But I think his exact quote after the game I heard last night was something along the lines of, "We were okay until the final third," and then he said something like, "That's why we pay the money for those players," or something like that. And it's absolutely, it's 100% correct. And they paid 40 million for somebody who they thought would put a ball in the back of the net. And if that person had put 3 goals in 58, Callum Wilson has scored 10 this season on his own. It's scary how bad he is. And as I said earlier, or a month ago, it's unforgivable. It really is unforgivable. And Steve Bruce has to live with that. He has to work with this guy. And now, because of Callum Wilson's injury, he has to play this guy.
Yeah, an hour gone at Selhurst Park, still 0-0. I'll keep you up to date with that throughout the rest of the programme. For those of you interested, at the other end of the table, Leicester were 1-0 up, but they're now 3-1 down at home to Arsenal. Roger Cook, he says, do you think the defence was better with Dubravka, Mick?
I think I said when I was on here last time that for all the people shouting and screaming and lauding Darlow, I thought he was suspect on crosses. But I don't think Dubravka's the finished article by any means either. So I think what you've got is you've probably got 2 keepers who are pretty much of a muchness, and their strengths in both cases is shot stopping. And while Darlow for me is suspect on crosses, I mean, Dubravka's distribution last night was a disaster waiting to happen. I mean, either clearing his lines or passing the ball or taking back passes. Every time it went back to him, you were slightly worried and slightly suspect as to what was going to happen. So, to answer the question, no, not particularly. I didn't think the defense. I think the problem with the defense is the 2 fullbacks. I mean, Kraft is mediocre. Jamal Lewis, as I mentioned, is decent going forward, but is just not a defender. Kieran Clark, for me, is your absolute linchpin. Kieran Clark, again, was very good last night. I like Kieran Clark. He's a proper player. Lascelles has scored a goal, which, you know, when the cross goes in, you think, oh, it's Joe Linton. That's what a centre forward does. No, it's Lascelles. But fair play to him. He got in there and he scored the goal. But again, I think Lascelles flatters to deceive. But defensively, they're not all over the place. But I don't think Dubravka makes them infinitely better than Darlow would.
Yeah, John Askew's asking, as a respected journal, should the post-match interviewer be asking Bruce why he picks Joe Linton? But I think my question really would be, you know, why was he allowed to select journalists last night? He only accepted 2 members of the written press last night. And I don't know who it was. It'll be easy to find out. Just check the newspapers. But I find alienating himself from various members of the press. It's not gonna bode well, is it?
It's funny, Steve, because when I was on here last time, the story broke, or somebody texted in or emailed in that they'd heard that Steve Bruce, that the written journos wouldn't be able to question him in his press conference the next day. And I sort of said, I don't know for certain, but if that's the case and that's been taken out of Steve Bruce's hands, I would be absolutely devastated if I was Steve Bruce, because that is basically an admission that I can't deal with the written press. As it turned out, it was Steve Bruce's doing. You know, if this is Steve Bruce's doing as well, that's just bad. That's poor. You know, you either are man enough to front up, and you know, no manager, no player, you know, no. I mean, as I'll go back to the interview, and people should dig it out. Sonia McLaughlin of 5 Live did with Owen Farrell after the England-Wales game yesterday. She just kept on and on and on. And that is her right as a journalist. Owen Farrell didn't like it. Came very close to sort of spitting his dummy out and walking away. But at least she got to do the interview. If Steve Bruce is in a position where he can pick and choose who asks him questions, that's wrong. There's a very well-known journalist who I won't name, who talks about club press officers as Pravda, that they are Pravda, which for anybody who doesn't know the history, was basically the voice piece of the Communist Party when Lenin and Marx started Bolshevism, etc. But basically, it is a state-run, a little bit like, you know, Nazi Germany, where nobody gets to ask the questions other than those who ask the safe questions. Now, again, if Steve Bruce is going down that line, that's incredibly dangerous, and it doesn't endear him to anybody. It doesn't endear him to me, and it won't endear him to the press. And as you say, he won't ultimately do himself any favors at all. So I'm disappointed if that is true, that's what's happening.
It's the way it works, though, Mick, isn't it? I mean, you were involved for years, and every manager has their favourites.
Yeah, but you know, you say that that's the way it works. It wasn't ever the way it worked. You know what? When I was doing it, you know, everybody fronted up. If you didn't like it, you had it out with the journalist. If you didn't like the question, you flat battered the question. If you didn't like the question, you maybe had a go at the journalist. But what you didn't do was sidestep the question. What you didn't do was say, I'm not prepared to answer that question because I don't think it's a fair question. You know, you can't do that. If the question's unreasonable, people will make their own mind up. People will say, that interviewer is wrong, you know? But you don't say, I'm sorry, you can because you're going to ask nice questions, and you can't because you might ask a nasty question. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. The public have the right to know. And going back to the point I made about there being no crowds in the stadium, journalists are now feeding off scraps. So they have to pick up on things like, oh, did you just hear the substitute say to the other substitute, I hate the manager. I think the manager's crap, you know? Which would once upon a time, if there was 50,000 in the stadium, you'd never hear. And once upon a time, journalists would be respectful that that's off bounds. But now, because they're being treated as if, you know, they're not given anything, they've got to feed off whatever they can get.
Yeah, I would agree. Fungo Freddy's wanting to know if it's time to give youth a chance. And I think what he's trying to say really is, some of these players are just going through the motions. Would you give some of the youngsters a chance to shine and potentially keep Newcastle in the Premier League?
It's a difficult one, Steve. This is one of the big burning questions in football for years and years. Do you play a youngster and run the risk of essentially ending his career or certainly hurting and harming his development by throwing him into the difference being, of course, that in all of this, there's nobody watching them. Once upon a time, if you were Johnny 18-year-old and Johnny 19-year-old and you got thrown in and Newcastle needed 3 points to stay up in the Premier League and you've got a one-on-one with the goalkeeper in the 89th minute, your heart's going 5,000 to the dozen. You miss the post, you never play again because you're never forgiven, you never recover. Nowadays, there's no one in the stadium, so maybe there is more of an argument for it. The other side of the coin is, maybe the adrenaline's not there, and the player thinks to himself, well, what's the point? I think you have to go at this moment in time at the tough end and the sharp end of the season. You have to go with proven players. You have to go with people who, can cope with the pressure. And the pressure, as I mentioned earlier, is far greater on Newcastle because they are the bigger story than they are on Fulham or Brighton or Burnley or West Bromwich Albion, who are a big football club in their own right. But Newcastle, everybody, we know it, all the neutrals, oh, God, Newcastle are struggling. Oh, Newcastle will go down. Ashley, Bruce, blah-de-blah-de-blah. It's a tough, which is why, as I said, a month ago, maybe it is time for a change because it needs maybe a new broom to sweep clean.
Simple question from Spenny Mag. He says, do you see us staying up, Mick?
As I said earlier, I think I'm slightly more confident, and it might sound strange because Fulham are that much closer to us, but we are then in turn that much closer to Burnley and to Brighton. The one thing I would say is we've got 12 games left, and if you look at the fixtures, we've got West Bromwich Albion, Brighton, Burnley and Sheffield United. It's in our hands. What you don't want is a situation where it's not in your hands. Now, 3 of those 4 games are away. And if you look at the stats, and I said you can crunch the numbers in all manner of ways in your favour, against whatever way you think you can come up with a scenario. In 2008, 2009, we were relegated by a point. In 2015, 2016, we were relegated by 2 points. Fulham, last game of the season, is 3 points. I'm finding it almost impossible not to think it will come down to Fulham, if not Fulham and Sheffield United the game before. It's just the way it works. It's not like a tap. You can't turn it on and off, and they can't turn it on and off either. Fulham, Burnley, Brighton, whoever, West Brom. You can't go from being a poor team to a good team just because it's the sharp end of the season. You're used to losing. You're a poor team. They will lose. None of those teams will win, mark my words, none of those teams will win more than 2 or 3 games of the final 12. It's just a case of who you win against. And if we can beat certainly Sheffield United and Fulham, if not West Bromwich Albion away from home, we might be all right.
Yeah, okay. We were talking about this off air. We were going to bring it up anyway, but Tim Cairns has already beaten us to it. Has the officials in VAR missed again a penalty and a sending off as Sayers handled the ball in an obvious goal opportunity? There seems to be rulings for some and not for all. We were also talking about the ludicrous situation that developed between West Brom and Brighton yesterday.
It's madness, Steve, because as much as anything, we don't know, the players don't know, even the officials don't know what Stockley Park are deeming to be a right decision or a wrong decision. Handballs in particular, you've no idea. I mean, there were a couple last night, weren't there? There was the one that they looked at where a ball's, I can't even remember whether it was for Newcastle or against Newcastle. Ball's gone to the back post. Guys headed it against the back of the defender's arm, who can't see what the guy's doing behind him, and they're reviewing it. Why even review it? It can't be a penalty. It can't be a penalty. Other ones where, balls are blasted at arms, you can't get out the way. The one that really, really frustrates me, and I think if I was a commentator, I would just go mad. I would go nuts, is the offside flag never being raised until the end of the move, until we've had some sort of completion of what was happening. So last night, everyone's talking about Almiron hitting that post. I'm not sure Almiron was onside or offside, and we won't ever know. I mean, we saw a couple of replays last night which weren't conclusive, but because the ball didn't end up in the back of the net, it was never reviewed. The whole situation is crazy, and the situation at West Brom last night. I mean, even the referees must hate this. The referees must think, what is the point of me refereeing this game? Because Big Brother is watching me all the time. And regardless of what decision I make, they'll overturn it. Now, you knock that down a peg, linesmen, assistant referees are now thinking, what's the point of me being here? Because, I will invariably be overruled. I may as well just run up and down the touchline. If I raise my flag, I do it for the right reasons, but I'm not too sure it'll even matter.
Yeah, it's crazy. So I suppose this answers Neil's question, which is, Mick, if you could change one thing in football at the moment, what would it be? Would it be the flag or would it be the VAR?
it would probably be, although there are elements of VAR which are good. I mean, the big one, if you remember, going back 10, 20 years, whatever. The reason it was brought in essentially was goal line technology, because there were goals that weren't goals and there were non-goals that were goals, if you take my meaning. And that is fairly straightforward. But they then got greedy and they then broadened it. And then they thought, well, we can do VAR for offside. And then we can do VAR. And as soon as they started doing VAR, where there was a human element, whereby only the individual, only the human being knows whether he went to hurt somebody, only the human being knows whether that elbow was a deliberate elbow, only a human being knows whether he deliberately dived in the penalty area. A machine can't tell you that. A machine can't, a machine's trying to second guess whether. So now players are clever. So now players are coached to chip the ball against the arm of a player rather than chip the ball to their centre forward at the far post, because there's a chance they'll get a penalty, because the machine will look at it and think, oh, that's hit the arm. That's a penalty. It's mad. It's mad, Steve. So get rid of one thing. Get rid of VAR other than for non-human interaction in football.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Big thanks to our sponsor for this month, Spider VPN. They are staying on for next month as well. qtechshop.co.uk, the makers of pool tables and snooker tables in Wallsend, Newcastle. And big thanks to Jab Signature, who make all of our promotional material, flyers, etc. If you want to subscribe to the channel, click the little logo in the bottom right hand corner, hit the like button, hit the share button, and don't forget to comment. And if you miss us when we're out, when you're out and about, then you can find us on all the podcast channels, including Spotify and iTunes. And I will, of course, be back tomorrow night at the later time of 7:30 with the girls. Ladies' night is a Monday night, and the girls will certainly have a lot to say, as they always do. Let's get back to your questions. And Graham's saying, I cannot remember if this was asked on the last show, but do you think you'll ever go back to commentating on Newcastle or any other teams, Mick?
I'm not sure, Steve. I mean, it's a bit like everything in life. You never say never. I think I did joke with somebody. I can't remember. Or it might have been this last season when we had Brentford in the quarterfinals of the League Cup. I did say if they ever got to a cup final, I would really, really like to do a cup final. Although, obviously I've done a losing cup final, but hopefully a winning cup final. I think I'd probably just like to see them win something, whether I was commentating on them or not. Maybe not. I think you have your time. And Matthew Raisbeck is doing a good job in my place. Bearing in mind everything he's been through for the last month, I would hate to sort of deny him the opportunity of doing something decent, because I mean, how commentators and how journalists, to be fair, are going through what they're going through at the moment. I don't know. The job's not the same. I mean, the job's not the same for football managers. The job's not the same for football players. So, it's desperately difficult. But I'm not sure. Steve. Maybe not.
Okay, still 0-0 at Crystal Palace. Madge has just gone close. It's all Fulham, so let's hope that Palace can keep that door shut. James Brown says, who's the worst manager you've had to deal with in terms of the media in your days?
I mentioned Ruud Gullit and his lack of, probably empathy or belief in the football club. He was quite hard work, but at the same time, he was Ruud Gullit. This is Rudy. You can't believe that. He's walking through the door and you're interviewing him, and he's one of the greatest footballers the world has ever known. So you sort of forgave him for that. But it's a very, very difficult job. I mentioned last time I was on that. I think one of the reasons why I'm not sure where I stand with Steve Bruce is because I don't know him, and all those managers that I worked with, I got to know, and the majority I quite liked. Whether they were good managers, bad managers, indifferent managers. I mean, Joe Kinnear was a strange one. I mean, but then again, what I would say is Steve that Joe Kinnear was probably the most ludicrous appointment I've ever come across in football. And the strangest appointment I've ever come across in football, and I think he himself found it difficult to cope with as well. So he was a strange one, but there weren't any obviously bad ones. Probably Gullit, for the fact that at that time we were still really on a crest of a wave. We were still a club that was really, really potentially a happening club. And I mean, Alan Shearer says he was a good coach. If Alan Shearer says he was a good coach, then you can take it as read that he was a good coach. But as a person, he was quite difficult to deal with.
Okay, Freddie says the Longstaff brothers could have left last year for a combined fee of 50 million. This year they've not really featured. Their values have plummeted. Is this down to COVID, or is it down to Bruce not picking youth?
Do you know what it is? This is a very interesting question, Stephen. I was thinking about this the other day, and I wasn't thinking about it to do with Matty and Sean Longstaff, obviously. But this is an interesting point. I don't know what people listening to this will think of this, but I was thinking to myself, do you know what it is? It's amazing how many players. I don't know whether we build them up too quickly. There's probably an element of that.
Yeah.
But it's amazing how many high-profile players, and I don't count the Longstaffs as high-profile players, because God bless them, they were just finding their way. They were thrown in. They did well. They did some spectacular things for very young players. But it's amazing how many players these days, and I think it's because they're not in love with football, come and go. The two I was thinking of, I watched two games last weekend. One involved Dele Alli, who has gone from being, for me, one of the standout, extraordinary midfield players of his generation 2 years ago, and now might as well be playing for the Dog and Duck in Benton. And Jesse Lingard, who again, 2 years ago, a year ago, was an absolute mainstay for England, and is now on loan at West Ham United, and people were saying, I'm not sure about Jesse Lingard. These players, once upon a time, if a player was a player, he was a player. And he'd be a player for 10 years. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And yet, they come and go, they ebb and flow. And I don't know why. And I was thinking this to myself last week. And I don't think it applies to Sean and Matty because, they're young men finding their way. And that's not easy. And particularly in the current climate, because as you say, with COVID, with lack of crowds, with the way that you have to sort of approach training, etc., etc. But there are proven professionals week in, week out. Gareth Bale was the most exciting footballer in the world for me. You know, he was a player 5 years ago who, honestly, I would pay money in the same way that I'd pay money to watch Sinatra or The Clash or whoever. You know, now he's scratching around. They say he didn't want to play at Real Madrid. He wanted to play golf. You'll never find the whole truth. But he's come to Tottenham, and obviously Levy's brought him to Tottenham. Mourinho doesn't. But this is an absolute God-given talent that Gareth Bale has, and yet he doesn't seem to want to use it, or they don't seem to want to use him. So I don't know what's happening in football with players' progression and players' development. It's almost like, as I say, I can only think it comes down to love of football, and that in turn comes down to money. And if you've got millions and millions and millions, and that's what they've got by the age of 25, 26, what is the incentive to get out of bed in the morning, go training, go and play, wind and rain, no crowds, COVID? I don't know.
I'm a big fan of Gibbo. He does the Thursday night show. I love this week in the Chronicle. We haven't got leaders. A Bob Moncur and Alan Shearer, when he wore the armband, you just looked at them and you didn't dare drop your standards because you knew what was coming your way if you did. And that was from John this week, who always, like yourself, speaks from experience and speaks from the heart. Jamal Lascelles, I mean, you know, we talked briefly about him in last night's game. You know, is he struggling, do you think, with the pressure of the captaincy, Mick?
I don't know if he's struggling with the pressure of the captaincy. What I would say is, going back, when was it? I can't remember, but it was a game at Southampton, probably about 5 years ago, and I did an interview with Jamal Lascelles, and they'd lost again at Southampton, and God bless him, he did the best interview I'd had and done with a young player for years, and he came out and he said it like it was. He properly came out and said, "We're rubbish. Fans deserve better. We should be better. We need to look at ourselves. We did this." And honestly, it got played all over. 5 Live picked it up that night. 606. You know, Jamal Lascelles, young man, only new to Newcastle. You know, was quite highly thought of at the time. And then went on to be, naturally enough, a skipper of Newcastle. But I don't think he's kicked on. I think his heart's in the right place. But I think the problem with Jamal Lascelles is, whether I like it or not, he has to first and foremost look after himself as a player. I think he's got slightly sidetracked for the right reasons, by, you know, being a spokesperson, being this, that, and the other. He needs to look after himself as a defender, because as a defender, he has deficiencies, without a doubt. Kieran Clark alongside him, I like. Kieran Clark is proper old school. But I think Jamal Lascelles, you know, needs to concentrate on the football rather than the captaincy. I think if it was me, I might even take the captaincy off him and say, look, you just concentrate on being a centre-half, because he's a big presence. He's a good player. He scored a good goal. I mean, that's an important... I'm not kidding, Steve. In the scheme of things, that header last night, which Joe Linton should be making, or a centre-forward should be making, from a good cross, that could be the difference between staying in the Premier League and not staying in the Premier League. You know, that's how fine the margins are going to be in this relegation. So, you know, going back, you know, the original question was, do I think he's a good captain? I think he's taken the armband, but he probably needs to concentrate a little bit more on his defending.
5 minutes to go at Selhurst Park, still 0-0. Arsenal still winning at Leicester 3-1. Just a little update on the injuries. Lee Ryder has just posted this on Twitter, just to say that Alan St-Maximin is getting a groin injury assessed today, and Emil Kraft needs treatment on a shin problem. The club still no further forward on Almiron. Lee's line on that is that Steve Bruce said he was fearful for Almiron, who suffered a knee injury. Almiron's devastation at half-time had concerned the United boss and his teammates, so obviously we await news on that. Tom just asking, is the rant show on tomorrow night? Yes. We take the calls. Spenny was asking who you would play up front next week in the crucial game against West Brom if the worst case scenario does develop and Almiron, Maximin and Wilson are all missing. Would we have any more choice than Carol and Gale up front?
What are you doing next weekend, Steve?
Yeah.
It's an impossible question. It's an impossible question. I was looking. I mean, I don't know how many goals Newcastle have scored this season. I think it's 24 in 26 or something like that. Wilson's got 10. Almiron's got 4. And I think St Maxim is joint third top scorer with 2. So that's 16 goals out of a total of 24 or 25 that, this over the whole season. And if you lose all 3 of them, I don't know where you go. I really don't know where you go, because you're not only losing goals in the case of St Maxim and Almiron, you're losing the invention. You're losing the supply line. I said before, they frustrate me. I think they are quintessentially the modern day footballer, the athlete who really hasn't got a footballing brain in his head. But they are better, way, way, way much better than anything else we've got. So you take out Wilson, you take out Almiron, and you take out ASM, you've got serious problems. I don't know where you go. You probably, off the top of my head, I would say you might go with Dwight Gale at West Brom, who did very well there on loan, and West Brom wanted to sign him. So maybe going back to a familiar surrounding might help him. And then Andy Carroll is the other obvious one, just to sort of put a body in there who's a presence, as a physical presence. But then West Bromwich Albion, have been decent, and you've got Sam playing against Mike Ashley, who showed him the door. So I'm sure he won't want to do Newcastle any favours, regardless of whether he thinks West Brom will survive.
No, definitely not. John Ball wants to take us back onto the goalkeeping situation, and he just says, back on the goalkeeping situation, did Bruce make the right decision in bringing Dubravka back? As I think personally he should have saved the goal yesterday.
Hindsight's a wonderful thing, Steve. Absolutely a wonderful thing. He was at fault for the goal. He was at fault for 1 or 2 issues where he almost dropped almighty ricks with back passes and clearances. He didn't look confident. He looked nervy. He looked edgy. And yet, I don't know, with his shoulder, with his arm, whatever he's done, he saved the day late on. I mean, that's a point-blank header, which has just hit him and then gone and hit the bar.
Great save.
Yeah, it is. I mean, he's got himself in the way. He's made himself big. Regardless of whether it's hit his shoulder, his arm, his head, whatever, he's kept the ball out of the back of the net. So it has to be considered a good save. And I think, he is deserving of keeping the shirt. And Carl Darlow, as I said before, I think he's decent. I think he's a decent shot stopper, and he's done incredibly well, but he's been a bright spark in an otherwise incredibly dull season. So you shouldn't really judge him against what he's playing with. And I think Dubravka probably got enough brownie points on the basis of what he'd done in previous seasons to warrant coming back in. So I don't have any great hard and fast thoughts on either of them. But I think Dubravka it was probably due to come back into the side.
Yeah, I would agree. Mark says, Mick mentioned Joe Kinnear. Do you think had Joe not been ill, do you think he would have stayed in the job and he would have kept Newcastle up? Interesting question.
It's an interesting question, and the easiest way to answer it, Steve, is that, as with everything to do with Newcastle United under the ownership of Mike Ashley, only he knows. Only he knows. The decisions he makes, the things he does, the way he treats the football club, the way that he treats the fans, he's a law unto himself. So there is absolutely no point in second guessing him. It's the famous Cluffy quote, isn't it? If your auntie had balls, she'd be your uncle. It's ifs and buts and maybes. It really is. If Joe Kinnear hadn't got the job, what would happen? I mean, there's an argument that says if Joe Kinnear hadn't fallen ill, Chris Hughton wouldn't have got his chance, and Chris Hughton did fantastically well at Newcastle United. So, ifs, buts, maybes. With Mike Ashley, there is absolutely no way of legislating. There's no common sense. There's no logic. There's nothing. It's just him and his whatever little entourage he has. The decisions he makes, he's clearly on the. When I saw that conversation between Steve Bruce and Graham Jones last night, I thought to myself, here we are. He's done this again. He's meddled and he's brought people in who those that are at the football club already just want nothing to do with.
Jeff Carter says, can you think of anyone apart from Carl Darlow who was improved under Steve Bruce?
Oh dear me. I think, although he never really stood still, I think he's matured as a player. It's opinion, Steve. There'll be people screaming at this.
Of course, yeah.
The player I quite liked, and the player who I thought did stand still, but I think has grown, is Isaac Hayden. I think Isaac Hayden has grown as a player in the last 2 or 3 seasons. When he first came to the club, I liked it. I liked him. I liked his manner. And I remember me and Ando used to say, he's a proper Arsenal player. He's a bit like the boy Joe Willock. He's clearly been brought up with all the proper means and ways. And Isaac Hayden was like that. But he sort of stood still, Isaac Hayden. And I always thought, and it's interesting, that I'm not sure whether he's a midfield player or he could be a defender. He's a bright lad, a very, very bright boy. And I think he's come on. I think he has come on. I think Kieran Clark has been decent. But there are no real standout ones. And if people say, well, Almiron and ASM, they're just laws unto themselves, those players. They are enigmas. You don't control what they do. You can't really coach them to a degree. You just have to let them go.
I think it's finished final score, Palace 0, Fulham 0. So that's a good result. Could have been a lot worse looking at the way that game went. So they stay behind us by 3 points, not by the 1. And we shouldn't be relying on other teams, but it does us a big favour, that. So good news, Mick.
And it goes back to what I said earlier about Newcastle being the story. All the commentators and all the media were talking about last night was, if Newcastle get beat off Wolves, then Fulham can catch them tomorrow. And Fulham can catch them, and Newcastle could be in the bottom 3 by the end of play on Sunday. What you could also say was, again, going back to the glass half full, glass half empty, if Newcastle had won last night, we'd have gone above Brighton and Hove Albion. We'd have been a place up the table. But nobody wants to say that. No, nobody wants to say, if Newcastle win here and they're 1-0 up against Wolves, and but for a stupid, concession of a goal, which was a poor goal to concede, they could. I'm saying could, not would, but could have won the game 1-0. We could have been sitting here with Newcastle above Brighton, and Fulham looking to chase Brighton rather than chase Newcastle. Newcastle are the story. They're always the story.
Blue Moon Boy says, Mick, I've heard you speak about Sir Bobby not comprehending a player living in a house worth upwards of £1 million. Is that what we see at Newcastle? A reflection of the game as a whole, or just Newcastle?
Do you know what it is, Steve? This guy must be a mind reader. Because I was thinking this morning when I was coming on, I was thinking about, because there's this furor about the substitution and Matt Ritchie not relaying comments and this happening and that happening. And I was thinking about players taking responsibility. And I was thinking about players being mollycoddled and players being spoiled and players being treated like children and players being an academy from the age of 9 years of age. And whether I think to myself, because they're in academies at 9 years of age through no fault of their own, because football clubs do this, and they call them scholars, even though there's no schooling involved whatsoever. They just play football from the age of 9. They don't learn. They don't do the educational stuff that we did as normal kids. So actually, through no fault of their own, and I'm going to say this, through no fault of their own, when they get to 17, 18 and they start playing football, they're not the brightest in the world. And and as a result, you get the jokes about the credit cards, you get the jokes about this, that, and the other. And my mind went back to this story, and the story was that if Steve Bruce is struggling, and I'm sure he is, and I'm sure he's not the only manager to come to terms with the modern day footballer, I'm thinking, this isn't new. This isn't new. Back in 1998 or whatever it was, so we're talking 20 odd years, nearly 20 years. Sir Bobby came back, having been abroad for years, and that story I will tell it for people who haven't told it. So I'm at Chesley Street one day, and I said to Sir Bobby, "Have you found anywhere to live yet?" And Bobby says, "I'm looking to buy my boy. I'm looking to buy Kenny Dalglish's old house in Durham, overlooking the railway there." I said, "I know you mean, Kenny. As you go out of Durham station, if you look up to your right, there's a big red brick building. And that's where Kenny Dalglish lived when he was manager of Newcastle." He said, "I'm thinking about buying Kenny's old place." I said, "Bobby, I think Rob Lee's buying that." He said, No, my boy. You don't understand. I'm buying Kenny's old house." I said, "Yeah, I think Rob Lee's buying." No, my boy. You don't understand. It's £1 million house. It's £1 million house." I said, "Yeah, I think No. It's £1 million house." I said, "Oh, I think Rob Lee's buying it." Anyway, 2 weeks later, "Have you found anywhere to live, Bobby?" Rob Lee bought that house. So Rob Lee had bought Kenny's old house for £1 million. He had no idea that players could afford £1 million houses. He used to stand at Chesley Street. Look at the cars. Why are they driving these cars? I used to go to Fulham on the bus. Look at the cars they're driving. Honestly.
Brilliant.
You know, they are, and that was 20 odd years ago. Now they are completely running football. They don't need to answer to anybody. They don't need to justify themselves. Shay Given on Friday night, I watched Derby against Forest. The camera went in the crowd, and Derby were going to make a substitution, and Shay had his laptop showing Derby's next substitute what he needed to do when he went on. He's going, "So you do this, you do that," and this kid's looking at it. This kid's not Czechoslovakian, or because once upon a time you did actually have to explain because they didn't speak English. But no, this is just a kid who's going on against Nottingham Forest in a championship game on a Friday night. And Shay, as a coach, a goalkeeper, is an outfield player is being told where he needs to go. So this morning, when I'm told that because Jamal Lewis can't defend and because Martin Dubravka can't get a strong enough hand to a header that should be saved, Matt Ritchie is responsible because he couldn't get instructions. But the fact that Matt Ritchie has to go out and tell them where they need to go and what they need to do. Once upon a time, a right back was a right back, a left back was a left back, blah de blah de blah.
Yeah,
it's a different world, Steve. It's a different world.
It is a different world. Ludwig says, "Does Steve ever smile? He has the countenance of a doorman on a bank holiday." Well, actually, I used to be for 18 years. That's exactly what I did. Here's a photo of us not smiling on the door at Christmas, just for you, Ludwig. So we'll finish off, Mick, by looking ahead to the game next week.
Just on that subject, Steve, I should just quickly say, Steve Bruce probably wishes he hadn't smiled a week ago.
Yes, exactly. Oh, yeah, that was a big thing as well, wasn't it? Well, let's talk on that before we look at West Brom. Before we finish the show, I mean, that was it's just a bit of naivety for somebody who's been in the job for so long, Mick.
I think, as I say, and I think I said this last time, I think the problem that Steve Bruce has is, and it's not a problem for me, and he's had an illustrious career. I think he's a decent guy. I think he's a proper guy. And at the end of the day, he shouldn't have to worry about whether he smiles or not. But it's so naive, it's untrue. I don't think he should need to be told, but maybe he does need to be told. But if you're walking off against Manchester United, having been beaten again, I don't care whether Ole Gunnar Solskjaer tells you the funniest joke in the history of the world. You keep it deadpan. You just walk off. 10 minutes later, in the dressing room, you can do whatever you want in private. But you don't subject Newcastle fans and you don't subject the rest of the world to you laughing when you come off. And I get that he had a go at somebody who asked him the question yesterday, but I'm sorry, in his heart of hearts, if he doesn't know, he dropped a Rick there. And also, it slightly worries me that I think if it was me and a lot of other people I know, if I was walking off at Old Trafford, having been beaten again, thinking I could lose my job as a result of this, the last thing I would want to do was talk to Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. Never mind, share. And I don't care if Ole Gunnar Solskjaer said Newcastle are the greatest team I've ever seen. You just walk off, deadpan, even if you're not forcing it. That should be your natural reaction, to get off the pitch and be devastated and upset that you've lost a game of football.
Did you see the Shelby interview Paul Ideson's asking as well, where he just basically said that if you just run around, that's enough for the Newcastle fans?
I didn't see that. Was that after yesterday?
No, that was prior to yesterday. It was a private interview midweek, one of those podcast things that the club seem to be getting the players to do, but more or less just saying that's all the fans up here expected.
If it was a club interview, I'd be amazed if that's what he said, and I'd be amazed if that's what they let get out. As I said, I think last time, I quite liked. I thought John Joe Shelby was decent last night. I think by his standards, he was more controlled. He was more disciplined. His passing was decent most of the time. That would disappoint me. Oh, obviously, it would disappoint me, because I do think he's one of the. I think he's one of the good guys. I think he's one of the players who genuinely cares about what Newcastle do and what Newcastle don't do.
Yeah, it was Studs Up. That's where the interview appeared. If anybody wants to see it, it was quite an interesting interview, to say the least. Yeah, let's look ahead to next weekend, Mick, before we finish. West Brom, obviously difficult to say who's going to be playing until we find out what's happened with the injured players, but it's a game we can't afford to lose.
Well, you kind of, I was looking back at the stats, of the other relegation seasons. Rafa actually won 3 of 10. And still went down by two points. Allen won only 1 of 8 and went down by 1 point. So it'll be fine margins. West Bromwich Albion, I don't think they're the worst in the world. But I do think that Newcastle, without Callum Wilson, and if they're without ASM and they're without Almiron, it's difficult to think where they will create something from. Sam Allardyce I think Sam Allardyce will bill it as their last chance. If they win next week, they might. It's a hugely slim chance, but they might just survive. So I think he will be feeding them red meat all week. They have something about them that that they're not the worst team in the world. And I just fear for Newcastle in terms of their creativity.
Quick prediction, Mick?
I would take a draw. Without a doubt.
Great stuff, mate. Okay, I think most of us would. Obviously, we're coming to the business end of the season, so maybe try and get you on in a couple of weeks' time after we've played West Brom and after we've played Villa. So maybe he's on the 14th of March, Mick, if you're up for it.
Absolutely, no problem whatsoever.
Great stuff, mate. As always, an absolute pleasure to speak to you. You stay safe. See you in a couple of weeks, mate.
And you, Steve. Cheers, mate.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Attack. It feels like I've been talking to myself again, but it's the only way